They say betrayal doesn't start with a single act. It's a series of small cracks that eventually break everything apart. For years, I thought I had control over my life, over my family, but that illusion shattered the day everything changed. It was supposed to be a simple outing, just me and my son, Jason. My husband, Mark, had canceled at the last minute again, citing another important meeting. At this point, his absence didn't surprise me. It had become routine. I smiled through it, told myself it didn't matter, but deep down I felt invisible. Jason, at 18, was no longer the boy I once tucked into bed. He was tall now, broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence that sometimes caught me off guard. That day, as we drove to the beach, he sat beside me, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. When we reached the beach, the sun was high, the sky an endless stretch of blue. I laid out the blanket and kicked off my shoes, letting the sand sink between my toes. "Jason," I called, holding up a bottle of sunscreen, "can you help me with my back? I can't reach it." He hesitated, his dark eyes meeting mine briefly. Yeah, sure," he replied, taking the bottle. I laid down on the blanket, the warmth of the sun pressing against my skin. His hands were tentative at first, smoothing the lotion over my shoulders and upper back. "You don't have to be so careful," I said lightly, laughing to ease the awkwardness. "I won't break." He chuckled softly and pressed harder, his hands firm now, moving slowly. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation of his touch soothe me, something I hadn't felt in years. But then his hands moved lower, lingering at the curve of my back. My breath caught, and I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. The air between us shifted, heavy and tense. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I could have stopped him. I should have. But instead I whispered, "It's fine." His hands hovered there for a moment before moving lower, brushing against the edge of my swimsuit. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. I stayed still, paralyzed between guilt and something I couldn't name. That was the moment everything changed. The drive home that evening was quiet, almost suffocating. Jason sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window, his jaw tight and his hands fidgeting with his phone. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, trying to focus on the road and not on the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I replayed the moment on the beach over and over in my head. His hands, the way they lingered, the way my body reacted when I should have pulled away. Guilt gnawed at me, but it was tangled with something darker, an undeniable warmth that scared me. When we got home, Mark was already in his office, glued to his computer screen like always. I barely acknowledged him as I walked past, heading straight for the kitchen to busy myself with dinner. Jason hovered in the doorway, his presence heavy, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. "Did you have fun?" Mark called out from his office, not even bothering to come out. His voice was casual, indifferent, like he was asking about the weather. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile even though he couldn't see it. "It was nice." Jason disappeared into his room shortly after dinner, and I was left alone in the silence of the house. Mark worked late into the night, as usual, while I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. My mind wasn't on the show playing. It was on Jason. I hated myself for it. He was my son. This was wrong, unnatural. But the way he had looked at me on the beach, the hesitation in his touch, the questions in his eyes, they were impossible to ignore. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I made breakfast, chatted about Jason's plans for the day, and smiled as though nothing had happened. But every time our eyes met, I felt that same heavy tension, like a secret neither of us could put into words. Later that evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, I felt Jason's presence behind me. My heart raced, and I braced myself for what he might say. "Mom," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. I turned to face him, my hands still wet from the soapy water. "Yes." He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Then he took a step closer, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for a glass on the counter. The touch was brief, innocent on the surface, but it sent a shiver through me. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "About yesterday. I didn't mean to." "It's okay," I interrupted, my voice shaky. "Let's not talk about it." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me this wasn't over. That night, as I lay in bed next to Mark, listening to his soft snores, I couldn't stop thinking about Jason. His touch, his gaze, the unspoken tension between us. It was all-consuming. I knew I should put an end to it, but I didn't know how. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Jason and I avoided being alone together, but the tension lingered, thick and undeniable. Every glance he stole, every brush of his hand when passing by, it all added to the storm brewing inside me. Mark remained oblivious. He was always too busy with work to notice much of anything. I envied his ignorance, how easy it was for him to carry on with life while I felt trapped in my own skin, weighed down by guilt, and something else I refused to name. One afternoon, I found myself folding laundry in the living room while Jason sat across from me, scrolling through his phone. The silence between us was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of fabric. "Mom," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I looked up, startled. "Yes." He hesitated, his eyes locked on mine. "About the other day." Jason," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I intended. "We don't need to talk about it. It was a mistake. Let's just move on." His expression tightened, a mix of frustration and something deeper. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his tone soft but insistent. I froze, the air between us charged with unspoken words. I wanted to say yes, to tell him we needed to forget everything and go back to the way things were. But the words wouldn't come. Before I could respond, Mark walked in, his tie loose and his briefcase in hand. "Hey, what's for dinner?" he asked casually, oblivious to the tension that filled the room. I was just about to start," I stammered, quickly gathering the laundry and heading for the kitchen. Jason stayed behind, his eyes following me as I left. That evening, I tried to bury myself in the routine, cooking, cleaning, making small talk with Mark. But every time I glanced at Jason, sitting silently at the table, I felt the weight of his gaze. Later that night, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Jason. "Mom," he said, his voice low and deliberate. I turned, my heart pounding. "Jason, please don't." "I can't stop thinking about it," he said, cutting me off. His eyes were intense, his words heavy with meaning. "About you." My breath hitched, and I took a step back, gripping the counter for support. "This has to stop," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I know it's wrong," he said, stepping closer, "but I can't help it. Can you?" His words hung in the air, daring me to answer. I couldn't. Instead, I turned away, my hands trembling as I clutched the edge of the sink. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice filled with a mix of regret and longing. "I'll go." I didn't turn around until I heard his footsteps fade down the hall. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the ache in my chest as I watched him walk away. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. This wasn't just about him. It was about me, about the loneliness I had been drowning in for years. And no matter how wrong it was, part of me didn't want it to stop. The next weekend, Mark had yet another work trip, leaving Jason and me alone in the house. I had hoped the space would ease the tension between us, but it only made things worse. Every shared glance, every accidental touch felt heavier, like it carried a secret neither of us could ignore. Saturday morning, I decided to keep busy and suggested we clean the garage, a task that hadn't been tackled in years. Jason agreed without hesitation, though I noticed the way his gaze lingered when he looked at me, as if he was searching for something unspoken. We spent the first couple of hours sorting through old boxes, laughing over forgotten keepsakes and dusty photo albums. For a while, it felt almost normal, like we were just a mother and son sharing a quiet day together. But then, as the afternoon wore on, the air between us began to shift again. I climbed a small step stool to reach a shelf, stretching to grab a box from the top. Jason stood behind me, his hands instinctively moving to steady the stool. "Careful," he said, his voice low. "I've got it," I replied, but as I pulled the box down, I wobbled slightly. His hands moved to my waist to steady me, and suddenly, everything around us seemed to freeze. His touch lingered longer than it should have, his fingers pressing gently against my sides. I froze, my heart pounding as I held the box in my hands, unsure whether to move or stay still. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, closer. "Yeah," I managed to whisper, though my breath was uneven. As I stepped down from the stool, his hands remained at my waist, steadying me until I was back on the ground. We were standing too close now, the space between us barely existent. I should have stepped back, created distance, but I didn't. Instead, I looked up at him, and for the first time, I saw the conflict in his eyes. It wasn't just attraction, it was confusion, guilt, and something deeper. "Jason, we can't," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied, but he didn't move. I don't know how to stop." Neither did I. The moment passed when the sound of a neighbor's lawnmower broke the silence, pulling us both back to reality. I stepped away, clutching the box to my chest like it could shield me from everything I was feeling. "We should take a break," I said quickly, my voice shaky. "Go grab some water." Jason nodded, his expression unreadable, and walked out of the garage. I stood there for a long time, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Later that evening, we barely spoke. He stayed in his room, and I stayed in mine, each of us avoiding the other as though distance could erase the memory of that moment. But I knew it couldn't. That night, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, I realized something terrifying. No matter how wrong it was, a part of me didn't want to stop. The next few days were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. Jason and I moved around each other like strangers sharing the same space, pretending everything was normal. But it wasn't. I tried to distract myself with the usual routines, cleaning, cooking, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, but it didn't work. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his hands on me, his gaze burning into mine, the weight of everything we weren't saying hanging heavy in the air. By midweek, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to address the tension head-on, to remind both of us that this had to stop before it spiraled further out of control. "Jason," I called from the kitchen as he passed by. "Can we talk?" He froze mid-step, his shoulders stiffening before he turned to face me. "Sure," he said, his voice cautious. I gestured to the kitchen table, and we sat across from each other, the space between us feeling both too much and not enough. "I think we need to talk about what's been happening," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the edge of the table. "I know it's wrong," he said before I could continue. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Mom. I've tried, but I can't." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I wanted to scold him, to tell him how wrong this was, but instead, I felt my resolve crumbling. "Jason, we can't, this isn't right," I said, my voice shaking. "You know that, don't you?" He nodded, but his eyes met mine with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "I know, but do you feel it too? Or is it just me?" My throat tightened and I couldn't answer. The truth was I did feel it, the pull, the connection, the loneliness that seemed to disappear when he was near. "I don't know," I lied, breaking eye contact. Silence hung between us, thick and suffocating. Finally, Jason stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with a mix of frustration and sadness. "I didn't mean to make this harder for you." Before I could respond, he left the room, and I was alone again, staring at the empty chair where he had just been sitting. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with thoughts of him, his words, his touch, the way he looked at me. I knew I had to put an end to this, to fix what was broken before it destroyed us both. But deep down, I also knew the truth I wasn't ready to admit. I didn't want to let it go. By the weekend, Mark was gone on another business trip, leaving Jason and me alone in the house again. I tried to keep busy, filling my time with chores, errands, anything to avoid the weight of his presence. But the tension only seemed to grow. On Saturday afternoon, I decided to take a long bath, hoping the warm water would calm my nerves. I locked the door, lit a candle, and sank into the tub, letting the silence wrap around me like a cocoon. But even there, my thoughts were restless, circling back to Jason. I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't hear him knock. It wasn't until his voice broke through the haze that I realized he was standing just outside the door. "Mom," he called softly. My heart jumped, and I quickly wrapped a towel around myself, standing in the warm steam. "Yes. Can I talk to you for a second?" His voice was hesitant, unsure. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct told me to say no, to send him away. But something deeper, a part of me I didn't want to acknowledge, pulled me in the other direction. I opened the door just a crack, peering out at him. He was standing there, his hands in his pockets, his expression conflicted. "What is it?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He stepped closer, his eyes meeting mine. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't mean to make things weird. I felt a pang of guilt at his words, but it was overshadowed by the warmth of his gaze, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. "It's okay," I said, my voice trembling. "We'll get past this." But he didn't move. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine on the edge of the door. The touch was electric, sending a shiver through me. "Jason," I began, trying to pull away, but he stopped me with a single word. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just tell me you don't feel anything. If you say that, I'll stop." I couldn't answer. My throat tightened, my heart pounding as the truth hung heavy between us. I wanted to deny it, to lie and tell him I felt nothing, but I couldn't. Instead, I stepped back, closing the door gently but firmly. The weight of his words and my silence pressed down on me as I sank back against the wall, the steam from the bath clinging to my skin. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment at the door over and over again. I knew I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something I couldn't take back. And yet, part of me was already too far gone to turn back. The next morning, the air in the house felt different, charged, heavy, and impossible to ignore. I avoided Jason as much as I could, busying myself with every chore I could think of. But every time I passed him in the hallway, every accidental glance, I felt it. The pull, the connection, the secret we couldn't name but also couldn't escape. By mid-afternoon, I gave up pretending to focus on anything else. I grabbed my keys and announced, "I'm going for a drive," without waiting for a response. Jason didn't stop me, but I could feel his eyes on me as I walked out the door. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, hoping the open road and fresh air would clear my mind. It didn't. No matter how far I went, my thoughts stayed tethered to him. When I finally returned, the house was eerily quiet. I found Jason in the living room, sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up when I walked in, and the pain in his eyes nearly broke me. "Mom," he said, standing as I entered. "Can we talk? Please." I hesitated, my hand still on the doorknob. Part of me wanted to run, to leave and never look back. But I couldn't. "Okay," I said softly, closing the door behind me. We sat down across from each other, the silence between us almost unbearable. "I know this isn't normal," he began, his voice trembling. "I know it's wrong, but I can't stop. And I don't think you can either." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. "I don't know what's happening," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how we got here." Jason leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "Maybe it's because Dad's never around. Maybe it's because you feel alone. I don't know. But I can't pretend this isn't real anymore." Tears welled in my eyes, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Jason, we can't, this isn't." "I know," he said, cutting me off. "But that doesn't change how I feel." The room was suffocatingly quiet as his words hung in the air. I wanted to deny everything, to tell him we had to stop, but instead, I found myself leaning into the tension, letting it consume me. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I didn't pull away. My breath hitched, and I looked up at him, our eyes locking in a moment that felt both wrong and inevitable. "Jason," I whispered, my voice trembling, "this has to stop." "Then tell me to leave," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Tell me to go, and I will." I couldn't. Instead, I stood abruptly, breaking the moment. "I can't do this," I said, my voice shaking. "I need time to think." Without another word, I walked out of the room, leaving him sitting there, the weight of our unspoken truth pressing down on both of us. The following evening, I found myself in the kitchen pretending to cook dinner, though my mind was miles away. Jason had been unusually quiet all day, giving me space, though his absence in the room felt more noticeable than his presence. As I stood by the stove, stirring aimlessly, I heard his footsteps behind me. My heart sped up even before he spoke. "Mom," he said softly, his voice closer than I expected. I turned slowly, clutching the wooden spoon like it was a lifeline. "Jason, not now," I said, my voice trembling. But he didn't stop. He stepped closer, the weight of his gaze locking me in place. "I can't keep avoiding this," he said. "We both know what's happening. Pretending it's not there won't make it go away." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words caught in my throat. He was right. The tension between us had become unbearable, a silent force pulling us together despite everything we knew. "Jason, you're my son," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I know," he replied, his tone heavy with conflict. "And I know how wrong this is. But I can't stop how I feel, and I don't think you can either." Tears filled my eyes as I shook my head, trying to push him away with words I didn't even believe. "This isn't right. It's not normal." He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The touch sent a shiver through me, and I froze, unable to pull away. "I'm not asking for anything," he said softly. I need to know if you feel it too." His words were a plea, a desperate attempt to understand the chaos we had both been drowning in. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to protect him, I couldn't lie. "Yes," I whispered, the admission spilling out before I could stop it. "I feel it too." The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of my confession hanging in the air. Jason stepped closer, his fingers intertwining with mine. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice trembling. I pulled my hand away, my heart pounding. "We stop," I said firmly, though my resolve was cracking with every breath. "We can't let this go any further." But even as I spoke the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of everything we'd said and done pressing down on me. I knew I should put an end to this, to draw a line and never cross it again. But deep down, I wasn't sure I had the strength. The next morning, the tension in the house was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands, carried a weight that neither of us could escape. I thought about leaving, taking a walk, going for a drive, anything to put distance between us. But I stayed, as though part of me wanted to see where this would lead. By the afternoon, Jason found me in the living room. I was folding laundry, trying to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander. He sat down on the couch across from me, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, breaking the silence. "Jason," I began, shaking my head, "there's nothing to talk about." "We agreed, this has to stop." "Then why doesn't it feel like it's stopping?" he countered, his voice calm but insistent. "Why do I feel like it's only getting harder to ignore?" I set the laundry down, my hands trembling. "Because, I don't know, maybe we just need time. Maybe this is all in our heads." "It doesn't feel like it's in my head," he said, leaning forward. "It feels real, and I think you feel it too." His words struck a chord I couldn't ignore. The truth was, I did feel it, this unexplainable pull, this connection that blurred every line I thought was unbreakable. But admitting it felt like stepping off a cliff, and I wasn't sure if I'd survive the fall. "Jason, I'm your mother," I said finally, my voice cracking. This isn't who we are." "Then what are we?" he asked, his voice softer now, filled with uncertainty. "Because I don't know how to be around you anymore without feeling this." I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the storm building between us. But when I opened them, he was still there, his gaze unwavering, his presence impossible to ignore. "I don't know," I whispered, the admission tearing through me. "I don't know how to fix this." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we couldn't say. And then he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine. "Mom," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I don't want to hurt you. I don't know how to stop feeling this way." I pulled my hand back, standing abruptly. "We can't do this, Jason. We can't. Please, just give me some space." He nodded, though the pain in his eyes was clear. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet. "If that's what you want." He stood and walked away, leaving me alone with the weight of everything we'd just said. I sank back onto the couch, tears streaming down my face, as I tried to make sense of the impossible situation we were in. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, haunted by his words and my own. I knew this couldn't go on, but I also knew the damage had already been done. The next few days felt like a slow, agonizing spiral. Jason kept his distance, and I tried to convince myself that space was what we both needed. But the silence between us only magnified the unspoken feelings, making it impossible to forget. One evening, I was sitting in the kitchen, sipping tea and trying to distract myself with a book, when Jason walked in. He hesitated at the door, his expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice steady but soft. I looked at him, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to say no, to keep the distance between us. But the other part, the part one didn't want to admit existed, wanted to hear him out. "Okay," I said, setting the mug down. He sat across from me, his hands folded on the table. "I've been thinking," he began, his gaze locked on mine. "I know this isn't normal and I know it's wrong. But I also know how I feel, and I don't think those feelings are going to go away." "Jason," I interrupted, my voice trembling, "this can't happen. You know that, don't you?" "I do," he said quickly. "But pretending it's not there isn't helping either. I need to know if you feel it too." I looked away, my hands gripping the edge of the table. The truth was I did feel it. The connection, the pull. It was undeniable. But admitting it felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. "Jason, I'm your mother," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I'm supposed to protect you, to guide you. This isn't right." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't change how I feel. And I think it doesn't change how you feel either." Tears filled my eyes as I looked at him, his expression raw and open. "This has to stop," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. He nodded, standing slowly. "If that's what you want," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. As he turned to leave, something inside me broke. Before I could stop myself, I stood and grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Jason," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to stop feeling this way." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Then don't," he said softly. For a moment, everything else faded away. The guilt, the fear, the rules we were breaking. It was just him and me, standing in the quiet kitchen, both of us teetering on the edge of something we couldn't control. And then before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned forward and kissed his cheek, lingering just a moment too long. He froze, his breath catching, and I pulled back, my heart pounding. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know what I'm doing." He reached up, brushing the tears from my cheek. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together." That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of everything we'd done and said pressed down on me. I knew the road ahead would be impossible, that the secrets we were keeping would eventually tear everything apart. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. I know this story is complicated and raw, but your support means everything. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this.